In the winter of 1947, a county health inspector in rural Kentucky walked into a cabin that would haunt him until the day he died. What he found inside wasn't just poverty or neglect. It was something far more disturbing. 3 generations of a family living under one roof, but the family tree looked nothing like what nature intended. Brothers married to sisters, cousins bearing children with cousins, and at the center of it all, 2 sisters who had made an agreement that would create the most genetically damaged bloodline their county had ever documented. The inspector's report, buried in courthouse files for over 70 years, contains details so disturbing that local officials refused to make it public during their lifetimes. But death has a way of loosening tongues, and recently discovered documents reveal a story of genetic manipulation, family secrets, and children born into a nightmare they never chose. This isn't folklore or legend. These are real medical records, real birth certificates, and real death certificates that paint a picture of what happens when human beings decide that conventional morality doesn't apply to them. The Whitlock family name still exists in that Kentucky county, though most residents pretend it doesn't. Drive down the old mining roads and you'll find abandoned homesteads where their descendants once lived. The locals won't talk about what happened there, but the courthouse records tell a different story. They tell us about Martha and Sarah Whitlock, 2 sisters who shared everything, including the man who would father children with both of them, creating a genetic catastrophe that medical professionals still study today as an example of what happens when bloodlines become too intertwined to sustain life itself. Martha Whitlock was 19 when she married Thomas Hadley in the spring of 1923. By all accounts, it should have been a normal Appalachian marriage, 2 young people starting a family in the coal mining country of eastern Kentucky. But Martha had a secret that would define the next 3 decades of her family's existence. She had made a promise to her younger sister Sarah, a promise that defied every social and biological norm their community held sacred. Sarah was 17, unmarried, and according to family letters discovered decades later, terrified of being left alone. The sisters had grown up in extreme isolation after their parents died in a mining accident, and they had developed an unusually intense codependent relationship. When Martha announced her engagement to Thomas, Sarah became hysterical. She threatened to kill herself if Martha abandoned her for marriage. That's when Martha made the decision that would doom their bloodline. She told Sarah that Thomas would be husband to both of them. The arrangement wasn't just emotional support between sisters. Medical records from the county clinic show that by 1924, both Martha and Sarah were pregnant simultaneously. Thomas Hadley had fathered children with both sisters within months of each other, and the family began living as a polygamous unit in a remote cabin 15 miles from the nearest town. The births were registered under false names, with Martha listed as the mother of both children to avoid legal complications. What the sisters didn't understand, what no one in their isolated community understood, was that they were creating the foundation for a genetic disaster. Thomas Hadley wasn't just some random man Martha had married. He was their distant cousin, sharing great-grandparents with both sisters. The children born from these unions weren't just half-siblings. They were the product of multiple generations of intermarriage that had already weakened the family's genetic diversity. And this was only the beginning of what would become a 30-year experiment in human genetic degradation. By 1930, the Hadley-Whitlock household had produced 8 children. 4 belonged officially to Martha, 4 to Sarah, though in reality, Thomas was the father of all 8. The children grew up believing they had 2 mothers and calling both women Mama, which created its own psychological trauma that wouldn't be fully understood until much later. But the real horror was what was happening to their bodies as they developed. The first signs appeared when the oldest boy, James, turned 12. He developed severe seizures that local doctors couldn't explain. His spine began curving unnaturally, and his growth stunted so dramatically that by age 16, he looked like a 10-year-old child. Medical records from the county hospital, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, show that James suffered from what doctors now recognize as multiple genetic disorders caused by inbreeding, spina bifida, severe scoliosis, and a rare form of epilepsy that occurs almost exclusively in populations with extremely limited genetic diversity. James wasn't alone. His half-sister Mary, born to Sarah just months after James, developed similar symptoms, but her case was even more severe. She was born with what doctors initially thought was a cleft palate, but further examination revealed that her entire facial structure was malformed. Her eyes were set too far apart, her skull was misshapen, and she was completely deaf. Local church records show that Mary was kept hidden from the community, living her entire life in the family's cabin because her appearance frightened even the most tolerant neighbors. The pattern continued with each subsequent child. Birth defects, developmental delays, and physical deformities became the norm rather than the exception. By 1935, 6 of the 8 children showed signs of severe genetic damage. 2 had died in infancy from what doctors labeled as failure to thrive, though modern medical analysis suggests they suffered from multiple organ failures caused by genetic incompatibility. Thomas Hadley, witnessing what his choices had created, began drinking heavily and talking about ending the family line forever. But Martha and Sarah had different plans. They believed their problems came from outside influences, bad luck, evil spirits, or God's punishment for unrelated sins. They never understood that they themselves were the source of their children's suffering. In 1940, something happened that should have been impossible, but the Hadley family had long since abandoned the realm of normal human experience. James, the severely disabled eldest son, had somehow managed to father a child with his half-sister Mary, the deaf girl with the malformed face. The pregnancy nearly killed Mary, and the child that was born defied every medical expectation of what a human being could survive. The baby, who lived only 3 months, was born without fully formed lungs, with organs positioned incorrectly throughout its body, and with a brain so damaged that it never achieved consciousness. The county coroner, a man named Dr. William Patterson, wrote in his private notes that the infant was the most genetically compromised human being I have ever encountered in 30 years of medical practice. But this death didn't stop the family's genetic experiment. It accelerated it. Martha and Sarah, now in their 50s, began actively encouraging their surviving children to intermarry. They had convinced themselves that keeping the bloodline pure would eventually eliminate the family's health problems. They didn't understand that they were doing the exact opposite, concentrating genetic damage until it reached lethal levels. By 1942, 3 more children had been born within the family compound, all from unions between half-siblings or first cousins. These third-generation children represented something unprecedented in American medical records. They suffered from combinations of genetic disorders that doctors had never seen in a single bloodline: club feet, severe mental retardation, blindness, deafness, and skeletal deformities that left some children unable to walk or even sit upright. One child born in 1943 had organs so malformed that local doctors initially refused to believe the X-rays were from a living human being. The child's heart, liver, and kidneys were all positioned incorrectly, and yet somehow the child survived for 2 agonizing years before finally succumbing to multiple organ failure. Dr. Patterson, the county coroner, began keeping detailed records of what he was witnessing. His private notes, discovered in 1998 when his estate was settled, reveal a man slowly losing his faith in humanity. He wrote that the Hadley family had created a laboratory of human genetic destruction, and that he felt complicit in their suffering by providing medical care that prolonged their agony rather than ending their bloodline's torment. Which brings us back to that winter day in 1947, when County Health Inspector Robert Mills made the discovery that would change everything. Mills had been sent to investigate reports of child neglect in the remote mining community, but what he found in the Hadley cabin exceeded his worst nightmares. In his official report, which remained classified for decades, Mills documented a scene that reads like something from a medical horror story. The family was living in conditions that defied human comprehension. 17 people crammed into a 4-room cabin with no running water, no electricity, and minimal heat. But the overcrowding wasn't the worst part. It was the genetic damage that had accumulated across 3 generations of inbreeding. Mills found children who couldn't walk, couldn't speak, and in some cases, couldn't even focus their eyes. He discovered that several of the younger children were the product of unions between siblings, and that Martha and Sarah were still actively encouraging these relationships as a way to keep the family pure. The most disturbing aspect of Mills' report wasn't the physical conditions. It was the psychological dynamic he observed. The family had created their own internal logic to explain their situation. They believed that their genetic problems were a sign that they were special, chosen by God for some divine purpose that required them to remain isolated from the outside world. Martha, now in her 60s and showing signs of severe mental decline, told Mills that the family's suffering was a test of their faith and that outsiders wouldn't understand their sacred mission. Mills documented conversations with family members that revealed a complete disconnect from reality. The adults couldn't comprehend that their own choices had created their children's suffering. They blamed everything on external forces, contaminated water, evil spirits, government conspiracies, anything except their own genetic practices. The children, many of whom had never left the family property, had developed their own language and social customs that further isolated them from normal human society. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Because Robert Mills faced exactly that question when he realized that intervening might save the children, but it would also expose a genetic disaster that could destroy what remained of the family forever. Mills's report triggered a chain of events that would ultimately end the Hadley family's genetic experiment, but not before claiming several more victims. State social services, armed with Mills' documentation, arrived at the cabin in March 1947 to remove the children from their parents' custody. What they found was a family in complete psychological collapse, with Martha and Sarah barricaded inside the cabin with shotguns, screaming that government agents were trying to destroy God's chosen people. The standoff lasted 3 days. During those 3 days, 2 more children died, not from violence but from medical complications that their severely compromised immune systems couldn't handle under stress. The state officials, unprepared for the level of genetic damage they encountered, had to call in medical specialists from the University of Kentucky to assess which children could potentially survive outside the family environment and which were too damaged to live independently. The medical evaluation results, preserved in state archives, paint a picture of human genetic destruction that medical professionals had never documented before. Of the 11 children still alive when the state intervened, only 3 were deemed capable of potential rehabilitation. The others suffered from combinations of intellectual disabilities, physical deformities, and medical conditions that required constant care. Several couldn't speak, walk, or perform basic human functions. One child, estimated to be around 12 years old, had the mental capacity of an infant and the physical development of a 6-year-old. Martha and Sarah were eventually committed to the state mental hospital, where they spent their remaining years insisting that their children's problems were caused by government interference rather than their own genetic practices. Thomas Hadley had died of liver failure in 1945, never knowing that his decision to father children with 2 sisters would create a medical case study that geneticists still reference today. The surviving adults in the family, those capable of independent living, were relocated to different counties and given new identities to help them escape their genetic legacy. But the most haunting aspect of the state's intervention wasn't what they found. It was what they discovered had been planned. Hidden in Martha's belongings, investigators found detailed records of the family's breeding practices, including charts tracking which children should marry which cousins to produce the purest possible offspring. Martha had been planning genetic matches for children who weren't even born yet, extending her experiment into future generations that would have suffered even more severe genetic damage than what Mills had already documented. The Hadley family story didn't end with the state intervention. It haunted everyone who came into contact with their genetic legacy. Dr. Patterson, the county coroner who had documented their medical horrors, never practiced medicine again after 1947. He moved to California and became a carpenter, telling his family that he couldn't bear to look at another human body after what he had witnessed in Kentucky. Robert Mills, the health inspector who discovered the family, suffered from nightmares for the rest of his life and eventually required psychiatric treatment for what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The 3 children who survived and were deemed capable of rehabilitation faced their own tragic endings. 2 died before reaching adulthood, one from complications related to genetic kidney defects, the other from a seizure disorder that doctors couldn't control with available medications. The 3rd child, a girl named Rebecca, who had been born with relatively minor physical deformities, lived until 1983. She was placed in foster care, received extensive medical treatment, and eventually learned to read and write. But she never married, never had children, and spent her entire adult life terrified that she would pass on the genetic damage she carried in her DNA. The medical records from the Hadley family case became foundational documents in the study of human genetics and in breeding depression. Universities across the country requested copies of the state's files to use in teaching medical students about the dangers of genetic isolation. The family's DNA collected during the state intervention contributed to early research on genetic counseling and helped establish protocols for identifying at-risk populations in isolated communities. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy of the Hadley family is what their story reveals about human nature itself. Martha and Sarah Whitlock weren't evil women. They were ignorant, isolated, and desperate to maintain the only family structure they had ever known. Their decision to share a husband and encourage inbreeding within their bloodline came from a place of fear rather than malice. They were terrified of being alone, terrified of change, and terrified of losing control over their small world. In trying to preserve their family, they destroyed it more completely than any external force ever could have. Today, The cabin where the Hadley family lived has been reclaimed by the Kentucky wilderness. The foundation stones are still visible through the undergrowth, and locals occasionally report finding old bottles and rusted farming equipment in the surrounding woods. But no one builds there, no one camps there, and no one speaks of what happened on that isolated hillside where two sisters made a pact that condemned 3 generations of children to lives of genetic suffering. Some secrets are too dark to forget and too terrible to remember. The Hadley family's legacy serves as a permanent reminder that love, when twisted by fear and ignorance, can become the most destructive force of all.